Today, our discussion focuses upon a significant, albeit somewhat obscure, figure in the Torah, in the 5 books of Moses. Of course, we're focusing upon the story of Bezalel. Bezalel, who is first introduced here in Exodus chapter 31, in the context of the construction of the tabernacle and its various accoutrements, and is mentioned, admittedly, on a total of only exactly 6 times in all of the Torah, all in connection with the tabernacle. Inevitably, our concern, as always, is not treating the Torah as a historical narrative, even though it is, because that's not its purpose. And inevitably, the story of Bezalel, likewise, is here to teach us something. More importantly than about him, about us and our lives. Well, on that note, without any further ado, let's consider how Bezalel is introduced to us. What we see again before us is Exodus chapter 31, the first instance in which Bezalel appears. And there are some striking motifs that readily present themselves to us here. So let's start reading. And God spoke unto Moses, and what he says to him is, "See, I have called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah. And I have filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom and in understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship." And from verse 4, we read about the various tasks that Bezalel is to execute in the construction of the tabernacle, to devise skillful works, to do in gold and in silver and in brass, and in cutting of stones for setting, and in carving of wood, to work in all manner of workmanship. Of course, we should stress that it isn't only Bezalel, and in verse 6 we read, "And I, behold, I have appointed with him Aholiav, the son of Achisamach of the tribe of Dan, and in addition to the 2 of them, and in the hearts of all that are wise-hearted I have put wisdom, that they may make all that I have commanded you." And of course, what then follows from verse 7 and on is a list of everything that was commanded, concluding in verse 11, "According to all that I have commanded you, shall they do." Now, of course, again, we reiterate, this is a historical narrative. The tabernacle was built. But I think there is a critically important message to be gleaned in particular through our considering 2 terms that we encounter in this passage, and as we shall see, in the following passages that describe Bezalel and Aholiav as well. In verse 3, "And I have filled him with the Spirit of God." In verse 6, there is a description not only of Bezalel and not only of Aholiav, but of all the artisans as wise-hearted. And I submit that there is a kind of irrepressible tension between these 2 expressions. Because when we read about, "I have filled him with the Spirit of God," well, the Spirit of God strikes us as something that's coming from outside. Whereas being wise-hearted strikes us as an endowment from within. In much the same vein, we continue to the end of Exodus chapter 35 and the beginning of Exodus chapter 36, where we encounter indeed Bezalel and Aholiav another 3 times. In chapter 35, verse 30, and Moses said unto the children of Israel, see, God has called by name Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur of the tribe of Judah. And again, and he has filled him with the Spirit of God, in wisdom and understanding and in knowledge and in all manner of workmanship, again, to devise skillful works, to work in gold and in silver and in brass, in cutting stones, carving of wood, all manner of skillful workmanship, and likewise, once again, Aholiav, who is always mentioned, together with Bezalel, and once again in verse 35, them has he filled with wisdom of heart, the self-same expression, admittedly in a different construction, as the expression wise of heart, wise-hearted, that we already saw in chapter 31. And indeed, in the subsequent verses, granted that after verse 35, in Exodus chapter 35, we move on to chapter 36, verse 1, but then the division of the text into chapters is something that does not conform to any ancient tradition of ours, and structurally, the opening verse of chapter 36 is still part of the same command that was begun in the concluding verses of chapter 35. And here again, and Bezalel and Aholiav shall work, and every wise-hearted man, again, wise-hearted, in whom God has put wisdom and understanding to know how to work all the work for the service of the sanctuary according to all that God has commanded, and the execution, the fulfillment. And Moses called Bezalel and Aholiav, and every wise-hearted man in whose heart God had put wisdom, even everyone whose heart stirred him up to come unto the work to do it. So again, we reiterate, we have here, once again, the expression, the Spirit of God. He has filled him with the Spirit of God. And this accolade of wisdom of heart, of being wise-hearted, where at first brush, these terms, if not exclusive of one another, certainly seem to militate in different directions. Now let's explore what these terms mean by considering other contexts in which they appear. So first of all, the Spirit of God. In the Hebrew, Ruach Elohim is a term that is not only applied to Bezalel and Aholiav. To cite an additional prominent example, in Numbers chapter 24, we read of Bilam, the soothsayer, upon whom something like the spirit of prophecy comes. And indeed, in chapter 24, verse 2, and Bilam lifted up his eyes, and he saw Israel dwelling tribe by tribe, and the Spirit of God came upon him. Clearly, this is an inspiration from above. This is a divine bestowal. And he took up his parable and said, the saying of Bilam, the son of Beor, and the saying of the man whose eye is open, the speech of the one who hears the utterances of God, and so on and so forth. And Bilam gives us his immortal words of divine inspiration. So the Spirit of God, again, is that bestowal, something like a prophetic inspiration with which individuals are endowed. We'll note further, perhaps a parallel expression, in Exodus chapter 28, also, of course, in the context of the construction of the tabernacle. In verse 3, and you shall speak unto all who are wise-hearted, whom I have filled with the spirit of wisdom. The spirit of wisdom. Perhaps, at least formally, a different spirit than that which is described as the Spirit of God. This is in the Hebrew, Ruach Chochmah. But likewise, certainly, the implications when we speak of the Spirit of wisdom are a bestowal from above, as becomes manifestly the case when we consider where else in the Torah the expression the Spirit of wisdom occurs. In the very last chapter, indeed the last verses of the Torah, of the 5 books of Moses. And Joshua the son of Nun was full of the Spirit of wisdom, for Moses had laid his hands upon him. And the children of Israel hearkened to him and did as God commanded Moses. So of course, once again, the Spirit of wisdom is described as a consequence of Moses having laid hands upon him. In other words, as a bestowal. Moses manifestly here is the conduit of a bestowal from above. So the Spirit of wisdom, like the expression the Spirit of God, is something with which one is endowed. Whereas being wise-hearted certainly appears to be something that one has at the outset. And indeed, in that vein, we should note in the earlier part of Exodus chapter 35, when Moses commands the congregation of the children of Israel regarding the construction of the tabernacle and the various other aspects that pertain to it. So we read in verse 4, this is the thing that God commanded, saying, take you from among you an offering unto God, whosoever is of a willing heart. In other words, whoever is doing this as an expression of his or her own initiative, let him bring it the Lord's offering, gold and silver and brass. And in the same vein, that of your own initiative, through your willing heart, you make this contribution of what you have to the tabernacle, the construction materials, likewise, and let every wise-hearted man among you come and make all that God has commanded. So the Spirit of God, likewise the Spirit of wisdom, is a gift. You are given. Wise-hearted, it would appear on the contrary, is something you just are. And it's interesting for us to consider how these two characteristics play out with one another. It is, I should stress, important for me to note, and evidently important also for God to record in the Torah, that this attribute of being wise-hearted is gender neutral. It doesn't only apply to the men. Let every wise-hearted man among you come and make all that God has commanded, in the continuation of chapter 35. And all the women that were wise-hearted did spin with their hands and brought that which they had spun, the blue and the purple, the scarlet and the fine linen. And all the women whose hearts stirred them up in wisdom spun the goat's hair. And note here again the reference to the heart that in the previous verse is described in terms of wise-hearted. The heart, metaphorically, is also that which provides the impetus, the inspiration, the initiative. Just as in verse 5, whosoever is of a willing heart brings the various contributions as God's offering, so too in verse 26, and all the women whose hearts stirred them up. And stirred them up, we should stress here as well, in wisdom. In other words, again, it is the heart that is described, of course, metaphorically, as the seat of this wisdom that isn't so much bestowed, but rather that is what you are. Similarly, again, in chapter 36, verse 8, and every wise-hearted man among them that wrought the work made the tabernacle, and so on and so forth. This is the opening verse of a detailed description of the construction of the tent and the beams, the physical structure of the tabernacle. Simultaneously, while we appreciate that being wise-hearted is again something that you are, there is inevitably a scriptural association with the term to which we need to pay attention. Just as the Spirit of God, and for that matter, the Spirit of wisdom, comes, as it were, from above. It is a gift from God through which you cohere with God's will. So too, when we consider this description that you are wise-hearted, you are wise-hearted implies a consonance, a coherence with the one who is described as wise-hearted elsewhere in Scripture. In Job, chapter 9, and Job answered and said, of a truth, I know that it is so. How can man be just with God? If one should desire to contend with him, he could not answer him 1 in 1,000. He is wise in heart. Indeed, the Hebrew is virtually the same construction. Wise-hearted. He is wise in heart and mighty in strength. And of course, inevitably then we appreciate that the implication of being wise in heart is the capacity that human beings have, as it were, to cohere with the one who is wise in heart, with God. Of course, inevitably part of this stems from the realization that while we can speak of this dichotomy, you are given the Spirit of God, you are given the Spirit of wisdom. Wise-hearted is what you are. Well, you are wise-hearted, of course, inevitably, because you were given. That too is a gift. That you are wise-hearted, that is your essential endowment, is after all something that comes from God. And coming to that realization, I think it is particularly instructive for us to consider once again the implications of Exodus chapter 28, verse 3. And you shall speak unto all that are wise-hearted, whom I have filled with the Spirit of wisdom. Now, you might think that that's either redundant or otherwise unnecessary. If they're already wise-hearted, why bother filling them with the Spirit of wisdom? But then, if we view wise-hearted as, if you will, a native endowment, you are wise-hearted. Because that was a bestowal that pertains to your essential nature. It is, after all, an essential nature that's a potential. Well, of course, whatever you are, your character, your talents, your capabilities, these are all necessarily potentialities. The question is, inevitably, always, what will you do with them? So that bestowal of the Spirit of wisdom, of the Spirit of God, is necessarily superimposed on that native endowment, that potentiality that you have, that has earned you, arguably, has earned each and every one of us in varying degrees with the attribute of being wise-hearted. And of course, again, inevitably, the question is, now what? What do you do with being wise-hearted? Where does it convey you? Where does it lead you? Where do you go? It's instructive for us to continue in this light in our overview of the references to Bezalel by name that we encounter in Scripture. Now, just to keep tally, I remind you that the first instance in which Bezalel's name appeared was in chapter 31. And then between the end of chapter 35 and the beginning of chapter 36, we encounter his name on the second, third, and fourth occasions. And then we continue with chapter 37, occasion number 5. And this is, on the one hand, seemingly a mere detail of the vast construction process, but nonetheless, a most significant detail. At the beginning of Exodus chapter 37, we read, "And Bezalel made the ark, the holy ark, that was to contain the tablets. Of acacia wood, 2 cubits and a half was the length of it, and 1.5 cubits the breadth of it, and 1.5 cubits the height of it. And he overlaid it with pure gold, and he cast for it 4 rings, and he made staves of acacia wood, and he put the staves into the rings." And in verse 6, "He made an ark cover of pure gold, 2 cubits and a half was the length thereof, and 1.5 cubits the breadth thereof," that is to cover the ark. "And he made 2 cherubim of gold, of beaten work made he them at the 2 ends of the ark cover, 1 cherub at the one end, and 1 cherub at the other end. Of one piece with the ark cover made he the cherubim at the 2 ends thereof. And the cherubim spread out their wings on high, screening the ark cover with their wings, with their faces one to another. Toward the ark cover were the faces of the cherubim." So, of course, we have a very detailed description of the construction enterprise, giving us the details of the ark and the ark cover, followed, we should note, with the various other vessels that are then made for the tabernacle. Why am I harping on all the details of this description? Very simply because I'd like to call your attention to the fact that we read almost precisely the same description that is in chapter 37, the description of the execution, back in chapter 25 in Exodus, in the description of the command. "And you shall make an ark cover of pure gold, 2 cubits and a half shall be the length thereof, and 1.5 cubits the breadth thereof. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold, of beaten work shall you make them at the 2 ends of the ark cover. And make 1 cherub at one end, and 1 cherub at the other end. Of one piece with the ark cover shall you make the cherubim of the 2 ends thereof. And the cherubim shall spread out their wings on high, screening the ark cover with their wings. With their faces one to another, toward the ark cover shall the faces of the cherubim be." Now, it's clear. These 4 verses are almost verbatim identical to the corresponding 4 verses that we read in chapter 37, describing the actual construction of the ark cover. The only real difference is, of course, that in chapter 25, the conjugations are imperatives. This is what you shall do. Whereas in chapter 37, it's this is what Bezalel did. Now remember, our question here is, why is it important to focus upon Bezalel per se, by name, specifically here? And to answer that question, I think it's important for us to consider just what the significance in particular of this component of the construction process was. In Exodus chapter 25, after the detailed description of what needs to be built and how, We read in verses 21 and 22. And you shall put the ark cover above upon the ark. And in the ark you shall put the testimony that I shall give you. The testimony, the 2 tablets with divine script, divine words of the Decalogue inscribed upon them. And verse 22, even more critically. And there I will meet with you, and I will speak with you from above the ark cover, from between the 2 cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony, of all things which I will give you in commandment unto the children of Israel. In other words, the ark cover is, of course, part of the furnishings of the tabernacle. It is, after all, what covers the ark. But it's not only one of the furnishings. It is indeed the very heart of the tabernacle. It is the focal point, in particular, for Moses, the focal point of God's revelation to him. That revelation, as it were, is focused above the ark cover, between the 2 cherubim which are upon the ark of the testimony. In much the same vein, in Numbers chapter 7, last verse, verse 89, and when Moses went into the tent of meeting that he might speak with him, then he heard the voice speaking unto him from above the ark cover that was upon the ark of the testimony, from between the 2 cherubim, and he spoke unto him. Again, same location. The significance of the ark, and perhaps more so the ark cover, again lies in the ark cover being the focal point of the most intense, most extraordinary revelation of God to man. It is, we reiterate, as God expresses it, that place from which I communicate to you all things that I will give you in commandment unto the children of Israel. So the entire way of life, the entire structure of action, the deed, the mission that God directs to us comes into the world through, again as described here, above the ark cover, from between the 2 cherubim. That extraordinary communion between God and man. What amounts to, as we discussed last year in reference to Exodus chapter 25, the perpetuation of God's revelation to man at Sinai through the tabernacle and through the holy temple afterward. That is essentially what Bezalel was constructing here. So the appearance of Bezalel's name at the beginning of Exodus chapter 37 is indeed of utmost significance, not merely cursory association of an individual's name with the construction process. It informs us regarding the very nature of that construction process. Again, I'll reiterate. You are wise-hearted. Arguably, in varying degrees, we are all wise-hearted. And that is the endowment of a potentiality. That is something that we have, in varying degrees, natively. When you harness it in building, as it were, a conduit between God and this world, means through which God's word is revealed here in this world. God's guidance, God's dominion, God's sovereignty are manifest in this world. Then, superimposed upon that native endowment of being wise-hearted, you have acquired the spirit of wisdom, the Spirit of God, that additional dimension, that gift through which you actualize the potential in making this world a more godly place. That is not only Bezalel's summons, that is his identity. That's what he's doing. But inevitably, in our considering the significance of Bezalel, there's an additional dimension that I feel compelled to stress here. And this necessarily also focuses our attention on Bezalel's appearance by name at the beginning of chapter 37 and the contrast between chapter 37 and chapter 25. Or perhaps I should express it more broadly, the contrast between chapters 25 and 26 in Exodus with chapters 36 and 37. I'm not going to encumber you with a detailed listing of everything we read in these 4 chapters. I'd simply like to share with you one critically important global observation that is the focus of an ancient tradition that we have in understanding what the text is teaching each and every one of us specifically. In chapters 25 and 26, we read of not only the ark and the ark cover, but the various holy vessels that were placed in the tabernacle. The table with the showbread upon it, the menorah, the candelabrum. And it is after the description of these vessels that we read about the actual structure, the coverings and the beams that provide the structure of the tabernacle into which these furnishings are placed. While when we read of the actual construction process in chapters 36 and 37, I reiterate, the formulations are almost identical verbatim. We saw the example with respect to the ark cover, but throughout, the descriptions are almost identical to what we read in chapters 25 and 26 in the divine command. Just simply, instead of you shall build, they built the actual execution. But there's a critical difference between the description of the command and the description of the execution. Namely, remember, in the command, first there was the command concerning the vessels, beginning with the Holy Ark, and only afterward the command concerning the coverings and the beams, the physical structure. Whereas in the execution, in chapter 36, we read of the construction of the coverings and the physical structure, and it is afterward, in chapter 37, again beginning with the ark, that we read of the construction of the vessels, the furnishings that went into the tabernacle. Now, this might seem like a mere technicality, but upon further reflection, it couldn't be more remote from mere technicality. It indeed pertains to the very substance of Bezalel's endeavor and his identity. So here's the ancient tradition. Moses conveys to Bezalel what we read in Exodus chapter 25 and chapter 26. First the holy vessels, and afterward the edifice, the structure into which these vessels will be placed. And if we ask, why is that the order that Moses presents to Bezalel? Well, of course, after considering what the significance of the ark and ark cover was for Moses in particular, the answer is self-evident. This is the focal point. This is the heart of the tabernacle. This is the channel through which God communes with Moses. So of course the ark is first. right? Except that when Bezalel hears the command, the mandate in this order, he says to Moses, our master Moses, what's customary in this world is first you build a house and then you move in the furniture. You're telling me first make the furniture and then make the house? When I make the furniture, what am I going to do with it? Perchance, God told you that first we should make the structure and then put the vessels inside? Whereupon Moses, in this tradition, exclaims to Bezalel, wow, perchance you were in the shadow of God that you knew? The shadow of God is admittedly a play on words, or more precisely, a play on a name, because the shadow of God in Hebrew is Bezalel, Bezalel's name. That Bezalel's name, in some sense, prefigures his penetrating insight. But when you consider the meaning of this name, the shadow of God, the expression shadow of God strikes us as extremely odd, doesn't it? We don't generally think of God as casting a shadow. First of all, God is certainly incorporeal. But more than that, we associate God with shadow. Don't we associate God with light? But then it's, of course, important for us always to remember God himself transcends all categories. Any attempt to, as it were, pigeonhole God in any category is necessarily doomed to failure. But when we consider the connotation of shadow, there's a critically important message that's conveyed to us. And it's especially instructive in this regard to compare the identity of Bezalel with the identity of Moses. Moses is definitely not in shadow. Rather, much the contrary. In Exodus chapter 34, we read in verse 29 and the subsequent verses as well of a transformation in Moses. And it came to pass, when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in Moses' hand, when he came down from the mount, that Moses knew not that the skin of his face sent forth beams while he talked with him, while God spoke with Moses. Or perhaps a better rendition here is, had become radiant. His face beamed with light after that communion with God. So Moses is certainly not in shadow. Moses himself is luminous. And while that luminosity certainly tangibly expresses the spiritual greatness of Moses, simultaneously, it also bears a certain connotation that in the case of building a tabernacle is actually a deficiency. And it's so aptly expressed in the order of Exodus chapter 25 and Exodus chapter 26. Moses, being so centrally in the divine light, sees everything on a transcendent plane. And to that extent, such mundane concerns as, where am I supposed to put the furniture if I haven't built the house, just don't carry any weight. For Moses, of course the focus has to be upon the Holy Ark and the Ark cover. That's the focal point. That's where the tablets will go. That is where on an ongoing basis, Moses will be privy to the divine utterance, to the channel that conveys to him God's command, which of course is a lofty conception. But such a lofty conception, it can't be anchored in this physical world in which perforce, we live. In order to build a tabernacle, you can't just have Moses, who is perpetually in the divine light. You need someone who has the perspective, the vantage point of standing in shadow, who sees the physical world in all its physicality, who can then ask the mundane, technical question of, hey, Moses, when I make the furniture, where am I going to put it? But that in itself is what enables Bezalel to grapple with the physical world and make it into an abode of the divine. So, of course, far from being a disparagement of Bezalel, that he relates to the physical world, herein lies his greatness. Moses says again, wow, were you in the shadow of God that you knew this? I realize that you have a perspective that I can't share, but without your perspective, we aren't going to have a tabernacle. Your role is critical. And inevitably, returning to that duality, being wise-hearted and being endowed with the Spirit of God, what we could broadly describe as the process of actualization of artistic genius. On the one hand, there is that inner presence, that inspiration, that propensity. And yet, again, that's the potentiality that needs to be actualized. And when I say actualized, the critical dimension in that process of actualization is you aren't actualizing unless you're taking those lofty ideas and concretizing them in this world, making them something concrete, something real, something tangible, which is, of course, precisely what Bezalel and his team of wise-hearted men and women are doing. Taking the abstraction and actualizing it in this world. That's critical to build a tabernacle. That's critical for each of us in striving to make the world a more godly place. Now, again, I'm going to reiterate, chapter 37 is the fifth instance in which Bezalel's name appears in the Torah. There is yet one more. And with that, we continue in chapter 38. Now, chapter 38 gives us, if you will, the synopsis, the final ledger. In verse 21, these are the accounts of the tabernacle, even the tabernacle of the testimony, as they were rendered according to the commandment of Moses through the service of the Levites by the hand of Itamar, the son of Aaron the priest, and Bezalel, the son of Uri, the son of Hur, of the tribe of Judah, made all that God commanded Moses, and with him was Aholiab, the son of Achisamach, of the tribe of Dan, craftsman and skillful workman, and so on and so forth. What's so significant here? Well, I tried to make the answer obvious by highlighting it in yellow. As they were rendered according to the commandment of Moses, Bezalel made all that God commanded Moses. Because, inevitably we recognize that artistic genius is a wonderful thing, but it's also a volatile thing. It can even be a dangerous thing. Because in actualizing potentialities, there isn't any definite, a priori way to be sure that what will be actualized will indeed be godly. There's potential. But how is that potential going to be expressed? Especially when we recognize that so often that creative genius is indeed so volatile. It can go off like a bomb, breeding destruction all around. And the critical emphasis here is